Rome is commonly remembered as an empire that fell with a crash. The deeper truth is more unsettling. In AD 476, the Western Empire did not receive a single fatal blow. It revealed that the structure called empire had been living for decades on borrowed institutions, borrowed armies, borrowed legitimacy, and borrowed time. The great question is not who killed Rome, but how Roman elites, generals, foreign allies, and rival courts preserved the language of power while steadily surrendering the substance of it. The word fall is seductive because it flatters the human appetite for endings. A fall suggests drama, a final scene, a clear verdict, one last battle that explains the ruin of a civilization. But the Western Roman Empire did not collapse like a tower struck by lightning. It thinned, adapted, bargained, fragmented, recovered in appearance, and declined in capacity. Therefore AD 476 matters less as a cinematic catastrophe than as a moment of administrative honesty, the instant when the political theater could no longer conceal the strategic truth. To understand that truth, the chessboard must be seen clearly. The Roman world that entered the 5th century AD was not a fresh empire in full command of its destiny. It was the survivor of earlier convulsions. During the great crises of the 3rd century AD, emperors had risen and vanished at astonishing speed, frontiers had cracked, usurpers had multiplied, and external enemies had tested Rome from many directions at once. But the imperial system had not simply endured by rigid strength. It had survived by improvisation. The state had grown more militarized, more bureaucratic, more regional, and more dependent on emergency management. This was both its genius and its danger. A resilient state can absorb shocks. But a state that survives only by multiplying exceptional measures gradually teaches every major actor that rules are negotiable. The late Roman Empire remained formidable, yet it increasingly functioned as a negotiated order held together by emperors, generals, tax officials, provincial aristocrats, bishops, and military clients whose interests did not perfectly align. The empire still possessed majesty. But majesty and coherence are not the same thing. After AD 395, when the empire was effectively divided between the courts of East and West, this internal tension became impossible to ignore. The Eastern Empire inherited denser cities, richer commercial circuits, stronger fiscal machinery, and deeper strategic reserves. It had access to the wealth of the Eastern Mediterranean, to administrative traditions that could still transform population into revenue and revenue into military power. The Western Empire possessed ancient prestige, the symbolic authority of Old Rome, a powerful senatorial aristocracy, and vast territory stretching across Italy, Gaul, Spain, Britain in memory if not in firmness, and North Africa while it lasted. But grandeur on a map can conceal weakness in administration. Much of the West's territory was expensive to defend, difficult to monitor, and increasingly unreliable to tax. That asymmetry mattered because empires do not survive on memory. They survive on conversion. Can prestige be converted into obedience? Can land be converted into tax? Can tax be converted into soldiers? Can soldiers be converted into dependable force? By the 5th century AD, the Western Empire was struggling at every step of that chain. Therefore each crisis was more dangerous than it appeared on parchment. A frontier incursion was not merely a border problem. It was a stress test of whether the state still had the machinery to respond. External pressure did indeed intensify. But the old habit of blaming the fall of Rome on a faceless barbarian tide mistakes movement for destiny. Gothic migrations after AD 376, the disaster at Adrianople in AD 378, the Rhine crossing in AD 406, and the formation of stronger confederated groups within or near Roman frontiers did not mechanically doom the West. They became catastrophic because Rome could not consistently transform these disruptions into stable arrangements. The issue was never simply that outsiders had become stronger. It was that the empire had become less capable of integrating, deterring, paying, and directing them on Roman terms. Adrianople was a warning of enormous significance. The defeat of Emperor Valens by Gothic forces in AD 378 shattered any illusion that imperial armies still possessed an automatic monopoly on military superiority. But the deeper problem was political. The Gothic presence had emerged through migration, asylum, exploitation, mismanagement, rebellion, and failed settlement. In other words, it was not an alien storm against a healthy wall. It was a crisis produced by the interaction between Roman need and Roman dysfunction. Therefore the empire was not facing an external destiny. It was facing the consequences of its own bargains under pressure. The Rhine crossing in AD 406 deepened the strain. Groups moving into Gaul exposed how thin Roman control had become across the northwest. But frontier breaches alone do not explain imperial unraveling. The true strategic question is always what a state can still reassemble after the breach. Can field armies be concentrated? Can logistics support prolonged operations? Can provincial elites be induced to cooperate? Can usurpation be suppressed while external enemies are managed? In the West, these tasks increasingly collided. The government could still act, but each action carried a heavier opportunity cost. Hidden beneath these military dramas stood the strategic center of gravity of the entire Western system, Africa. North Africa was not a decorative possession. It was fiscal oxygen. Its grain sustained cities. Its revenues underwrote armies. Its maritime position connected Italy to a wider imperial economy. So long as Africa remained securely Roman, the Western court retained a chance of financing recovery elsewhere. But if Africa were lost, the West would not merely become poorer. It would become structurally less governable. The loss of Africa meant the loss of solvency, and solvency is the true battlefield beneath all banners. At the same time, the provinces themselves were changing. Local magnates strengthened private power. Municipal elites, long burdened by tax obligations and administrative duties, became less willing to serve as faithful transmission belts of imperial authority. The tax burden did not vanish, but it fell unevenly and generated resentment without guaranteeing security. The church expanded as an institutional and moral anchor precisely while the state's practical ability to enforce uniform obedience weakened. Bishops could negotiate, mediate, and preserve communal order in places where imperial officials could no longer compel much of anything. This did not mean the empire suddenly ceased to matter. It meant obedience became conditional, transactional, and local. Such conditions create a dangerous illusion. A state may continue to issue laws, appoint officeholders, and perform ceremonies long after its power has become contingent on actors it cannot fully control. That illusion lay at the heart of the Western Empire's final century. The language of command survived. But command itself was increasingly outsourced, bargained over, and fragmented. The tragedy becomes even sharper when the principal actors are examined. This was not a story of universal stupidity. Many of the men who shaped the fate of the West were rational within the horizons available to them. Emperors required legitimacy. Generals required troops. Regional leaders required land, status, and guarantees. The Eastern court required Western stability, but only at a cost that did not endanger the East itself. These incentives did not align. Therefore prudent choices at one level often generated disaster at another. Stilicho stands at the beginning of this final act as an early warning of what the West could still produce and what it could no longer protect. Serving as the dominant military strongman under Honorius, Stilicho understood that the empire's danger was not one enemy but strategic overstretch aggravated by court intrigue. He sought to balance frontier defense, diplomacy, and internal legitimacy in a world where resources no longer matched obligations. Such balancing required authority, trust, and time. But courts under stress rarely reward those qualities consistently. Rivals turned suspicion into policy. Stilicho was executed in AD 408. With that act, the Western Empire removed one of the last commanders capable of coordinating military necessity with political survival. The consequences were immediate and profound. Rome still needed troops. But after Stilicho's fall, factionalism devoured coherence. The massacre of families connected to barbarian soldiers drove many such troops into opposition. Therefore the government weakened itself morally, strategically, and militarily in a single stroke. Here the logic of decline becomes visible. An insecure court often sacrifices long-term strength for immediate political purges, because elites fear internal rivals more vividly than they understand systemic collapse. Into this landscape moved Alaric and the Visigoths, often remembered as destroyers but better understood as political entrepreneurs operating within Roman dysfunction. The Visigoths did not begin as a force animated by some mystical civilizational mission to erase Rome. They sought pay, settlement, rank, and recognition. They wanted insertion into the Roman order on favorable terms. But Rome's governments repeatedly failed to convert military dependency into stable integration. Therefore negotiable disputes hardened into existential confrontations. The sack of Rome in AD 410 was psychologically seismic because Rome had long functioned as a symbol beyond its immediate strategic value. The city was no longer the sole operational center of empire, yet its violation sent a shock across the Mediterranean imagination. But that sack was not simply the triumph of brute force over civilization. It was the visible consequence of failed bargaining, factional incompetence, and a state unable to decide whether armed outsiders should be annihilated, employed, or incorporated. A polity that cannot define the status of those who fight for it soon discovers that those fighters will define their own status. Even so, the West did not die in AD 410. That fact is crucial. It reveals how much adaptive power still remained. The empire could absorb humiliation, rearrange alliances, and continue governing. But every recovery now rested on narrower foundations. The margin for error had become perilously thin. The next major figure to understand is Aetius, often called the last great Roman of the West, though that phrase can oversimplify the reality. Aetius was not the guardian of an intact empire. He was the manager of strategic scarcity. Having navigated the Hunnic world and Roman politics alike, he understood that survival now depended on coalition warfare, diplomacy, and the careful balancing of one dangerous force against another. He used Hunnic connections when useful, provincial arrangements when necessary, and Roman legitimacy wherever possible. Such conduct can look opportunistic. But under conditions of decline, opportunism and statecraft often become almost indistinguishable. Aetius demonstrated that Roman strategic intelligence still existed. The victory against Attila at the Catalonian plains in AD 451, whatever the debates over its scale and exact shape, showed that the West could still assemble a coalition capable of checking a formidable threat. But the victory also revealed the altered character of Western power. Rome no longer prevailed through self-sufficient imperial force. It prevailed by orchestrating a temporary alignment among actors whose loyalty was conditional. Therefore every success contained the seed of future instability. Aetius survived by managing relationships that no longer rested on unquestioned Roman supremacy. Such men become indispensable. But in declining systems, indispensable servants often become intolerable to insecure rulers. Emperor Valentinian III, fearing Aetius' influence, murdered him in AD 454. According to later tradition, a courtier observed that the emperor had cut off his right hand with his left. Whether or not the exact words were spoken, the judgment was exact. The West destroyed one of its final mechanisms of coordination because personal fear overruled strategic reason. Then came Geiseric, the Vandal king, whose significance is still underestimated by those who search for Rome's end only in Italy. Geiseric grasped positional strategy with cold precision. By seizing North Africa and taking Carthage in AD 439, he did not merely win territory. He struck the Western Empire at the level that mattered most: revenue, grain, and maritime leverage. The Vandals became a naval power capable of threatening Mediterranean routes and dictating terms disproportionate to their numbers. This was not peripheral raiding. It was strategic amputation. From that moment forward, the Western Empire's efforts to recover durable independence were radically weakened. Without Africa, the court in Italy was poorer, more brittle, and more dependent on unstable military arrangements. One can survive military defeats if the fiscal core remains secure. But once the fiscal core is lost, even victories become difficult to exploit. Therefore the struggle for the West after AD 439 increasingly resembled the management of insolvency disguised as imperial policy. The failed expedition of AD 468 revealed this with brutal clarity. Supported heavily by the East, the attempt to overthrow Geiseric and recover Africa represented one of the largest military enterprises of the age. If successful, it might have restored the Western Empire's material foundation. But it failed catastrophically, consuming immense resources for almost no return. This was not merely another setback. It was one of the true death sentences of the West. After AD 468, hope remained, legality remained, ceremony remained, but the realistic prospect of full strategic recovery had narrowed almost to nothing. Within Italy itself, another figure embodied the changing logic of power: Ricimer. Ricimer never needed to wear the diadem to dominate the state. As a military strongman of partly barbarian background who could not easily claim imperial legitimacy in the traditional mode, he instead mastered the higher art of kingmaking. He elevated emperors, constrained them, discarded them, and ruled through the army while leaving others to bear the burdens of formal sovereignty. Here the old Roman constitution of authority had become unmistakably hollowed out. Ricimer's career illustrates one of history's recurring patterns. When formal office becomes dangerous and costly, while real power can be exercised indirectly, ambitious men often prefer manipulation to coronation. The title remains at the center of ceremony, but the actual center of decision migrates elsewhere. Such systems are especially fragile because accountability is obscured. Emperors still appear responsible, yet they no longer command the means necessary to enforce their will. A series of late Western rulers exposed this fragmentation in painful sequence. Majorian briefly grasped the nature of the crisis. He understood that military credibility, fiscal discipline, and administrative restoration had to advance together. He campaigned energetically, sought reform, and attempted to rebuild capacity rather than merely posture. But a weakened system often devours serious reformers because reform threatens every private arrangement that decline has normalized. Ricimer eliminated him in AD 461. Therefore, one of the last plausible opportunities for Western reconstruction was strangled by the very network of military brokerage that had arisen to keep the system alive. Anthemius arrived later with Eastern backing, which reveals another central truth. By this stage, the West could not even stabilize itself without aid from the stronger Roman court in Constantinople. But Eastern support had limits. The East wanted order in the West, not endless subsidy without result. Anthemius and Ricimer collided. The alliance collapsed into civil conflict. Once again, energy that should have defended the state was consumed by struggles over who truly controlled it. Julius Nepos, recognized by the East, carried legal legitimacy. Orestes held immediate military leverage. Romulus Augustulus, the child elevated by his father Orestes, embodied dynastic theater more than governing strength. By now the pattern was unmistakable. Legitimacy, military power, and fiscal capacity no longer resided in the same hands. Therefore the office of emperor survived, but the integrated machinery that had once made emperorship effective had almost disappeared. This is the setting in which AD 476 must be understood. Not as a thunderclap, but as the final alignment of symbol with reality. In AD 475, Orestes, a Roman general with experience in the Hunnic world, drove out Julius Nepos and raised his young son Romulus Augustulus to the throne. The gesture looked traditional. A ruler was displaced. Another was proclaimed. The costume of imperial continuity remained intact. But beneath that costume lay a state barely able to sustain its own army. Those armies were no longer simple instruments awaiting command from a stable treasury. They were political actors expecting payment, land, and security. This expectation was not irrational. Soldiers who made emperors assumed emperors owed them tangible reward. Therefore Orestes inherited not merely a throne but a debt structure of force. The crucial question was whether the Western state could still command service without surrendering territorial control. Orestes made the decisive miscalculation. He refused the land demands of federate troops in Italy. This was not a minor labor dispute in military dress. It was a referendum on sovereignty itself. If the army could no longer be paid adequately in money, land became the substitute. But granting land at scale meant acknowledging that the state lacked the resources to maintain loyalty through its older fiscal methods. Refusing those demands, however, required enough coercive capacity to compel obedience anyway. Orestes possessed neither a solvent treasury nor an unquestioned military monopoly. Therefore refusal became provocation. At that point Odoacer emerged as the most lucid reader of the situation. Odoacer did not need to invent a revolution from nothing. The revolution had been incubating for decades in every bargain by which Rome traded immediate survival for diluted control. He united disaffected troops, defeated Orestes, and deposed Romulus Augustulus in AD 476. The obvious interpretation would be that he simply replaced one ruler with another. But his true brilliance lies in what he declined to do. Odoacer did not proclaim himself Western emperor. He did something far more intelligent. He sent the imperial insignia to Emperor Zeno in Constantinople and ruled Italy as king under a veneer of Roman legality. This move recognized a strategic fact that many preceding actors had resisted: the independent Western emperorship had become more costly than useful. Why preserve a separate imperial court in Italy if armies, revenues, and legitimacy could be managed more efficiently through a single acknowledged imperial source in the East while real power on the ground rested with the man who actually controlled the troops? This was the profound irony of Rome's ending in the West. The empire was not ceremonially smashed by its conqueror. It was administratively streamlined. Roman offices persisted. The Senate continued to function. Taxation did not disappear overnight. Odoacer governed through existing institutions because legitimacy still mattered even after independent Western emperorship no longer did. The end was managed through continuity. That is why AD 476 feels so strangely quiet compared with the myth built around it. There was no final universal panic proving to every inhabitant that a civilization had vanished in an instant. Daily administration continued. Elites adjusted. Clergy remained active. Landholders pursued advantage. The forms of Roman life did not evaporate. But the strategic center had shifted irreversibly. What ended was not Roman culture, nor law, nor memory, but the autonomous Western imperial court as a viable command system. The deeper climax, then, lies behind the ceremony. By AD 476, the Western Empire had already been strategically broken by cumulative loss. Africa was gone. Field armies were weakened and politicized. Provincial loyalty had fragmented. Military kingmakers had displaced durable statecraft. The East remained Roman and more capable, but it had no obligation to endlessly underwrite Western insolvency. Therefore the deposition of Romulus Augustulus did not create the reality of collapse. It acknowledged it. What followed confirms the point. Odoacer ruled Italy using Roman administrators. Julius Nepos, still legally recognized by the East, lingered in Dalmatia until AD 480. The Eastern Empire absorbed the claim to universal emperorship. This is critical. Rome did not vanish in AD 476. The Roman Empire continued in the East for centuries. What died in the West was a separate imperial apparatus that had ceased to justify its own existence. That distinction matters because it rescues history from melodrama and replaces it with analysis. Across the former Western provinces, successor kingdoms emerged not as anti-Roman voids but as hybrid regimes. Visigothic, Burgundian, Vandal, and later Ostrogothic rulers inherited Roman law, taxation practices, administrative habits, and political language in uneven ways. Christianity became one of the principal vessels of continuity as imperial centrality receded. Bishops, monasteries, and church networks preserved literacy, moral authority, and social organization where the state could no longer impose uniformity. Therefore the Mediterranean world did not plunge into emptiness in a single night. It reorganized into a new political ecology. That reorganization carries the larger strategic lesson. Governments survive shocks when they retain four linked powers: the capacity to tax, the capacity to recruit, the capacity to command loyalty, and the capacity to punish defection. If one of these weakens, strain appears. If several weaken at once, emergency measures multiply. But if a state outsources force, tolerates elite escape from public burdens, and mistakes ceremonial continuity for operational strength, then every short-term fix can deepen long-term fragility. Rome's Western Empire did not lose because it encountered pressure. It lost because pressure exposed a system already surrendering the instruments of sovereignty. The human lesson is harsher still. Decline rarely announces itself honestly. Elites almost never describe a managed deterioration as deterioration. They rename it stabilization, accommodation, reform, flexibility, realism. Such language is not always deceitful in a petty sense. Often it reflects genuine hope under terrible constraints. But it also protects wealth, postpones blame, and extends careers. Entire ruling classes can participate in preserving appearances because appearances buy time. Yet time purchased without structural repair is not recovery. It is deferred reckoning. That is the true pathos of the late Western Empire. Many of its actors were not madmen dancing on ruins. They were functionaries, generals, aristocrats, bishops, and rulers making understandable decisions in a narrowing field of options. But systems can perish through rational behavior when incentives are misaligned. A general securing troops through land grants may save a frontier today while weakening fiscal cohesion tomorrow. A court eliminating a powerful commander may remove a rival while destroying strategic coordination. An aristocracy shielding its estates from taxation may preserve family splendor while starving the army that protects the realm. Catastrophe often emerges not from one monstrous choice, but from many defensible choices that collectively dissolve the state. The story of AD 476 therefore extends far beyond ancient Rome. It is a study in how political orders remain prestigious long after they cease to be sovereign in the full sense. Titles endure. Ceremonies endure. Institutions endure in name. But real command migrates toward whoever still controls men, money, and organized loyalty. When a state can no longer align legitimacy with force and revenue, it enters the zone of quiet death. Outward continuity becomes the mask worn by inward fragmentation. The verdict is stark. The Western Roman Empire did not fall because one enemy finally broke the gates. It ended because its ruling system gradually lost the monopoly over coercion and taxation that had made empire real. The sack of Rome in AD 410 shocked the world, but it did not finish the West. Attila terrified Europe, but he did not finish the West. Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus in AD 476, but even that did not erase Roman life. The true end came when the Western court became an expensive symbol no longer matched by administrative muscle, military obedience, or fiscal breadth. The cost of that ending was immense, though not always immediate in visible form. Security became more local and less universal. Regional powers gained room to maneuver. Law persisted, but unevenly. Identity endured, but fractured. Rome's universal claim narrowed into a mosaic of successor states, each carrying fragments of imperial inheritance while serving new masters. A civilization did not disappear. But its center of command did. And once the center was gone, the old promise that one authority could order the Western Mediterranean had passed into history. The modern mirror is unavoidable. This episode reveals that states do not become fragile only when enemies gather at the frontier. They become fragile when elites privatize advantage while public burdens remain collective, when military force depends on bargains the center cannot sustainably honor, when legal symbols are cherished more than governing capacity, and when every emergency solution quietly transfers leverage away from the state itself. Rome's Western Empire was talked around, bargained around, and ceremonially preserved long after its sovereignty had begun to leak away. That pattern is not ancient. It is perennial. The legacy question lingers beyond archives and ruins. At what point does a civilization cease to live by its founding power and begin merely administering the memory of it? History offers no easy metric for that threshold. But Rome in AD 476 suggests an answer severe enough to trouble every age. A political order begins to die the moment its guardians prefer the appearance of continuity to the reconstruction of capacity, and the moment those who still possess force discover they no longer need the fiction they once served.